The ear-splitting roar tearing through eardrums wasn't coming from jet engines. It was the sky itself, going mad and hurling its fury down at the earth. A spiraling wall of wind, racing at 168 miles per hour, was crushing everything in its path. The air was no longer something you could breathe. It had turned into invisible blades, lashing straight into flesh, peeling away sheet metal roofs layer by layer. Snapping reinforced concrete utility poles like dry matchsticks. In a pitch-black night ripped open by bruised purple lightning, thousands of tons of tempered glass from the skyscrapers in downtown Manila shattered all at once. It became a storm of razor-sharp glass, raining down onto flooded streets. Down at ground level, the sea had already surged into the city. Waves as black as ink, thick with mud and mangled car wrecks, rose as high as 23 feet. They were swallowing double-decker buses whole, wiping out every last attempt by people to hold their ground. The shriek of twisting metal, the boom of collapsing walls, and the howl of the wind merged into a symphony of hell. Even the strongest structures were trembling. There was nowhere that was truly safe. This is the destructive power of nature at its absolute peak. This is a hypothetical scenario, the worst nightmare imaginable. 2025 Super Typhoon Nando. Rewind 12 hours before the fateful moment. Manila, the Philippines. The sky wasn't dark the way people usually picture a storm. It was burning with a strange, bruised purple, streaked with murky orange like clotted blood, an effect caused by light scattering when the moisture in the air reaches absolute saturation. A chilling sign that the atmosphere above was being compressed to the extreme. The sun sank below the horizon, not in peace, but like a bloodshot eye staring down at Luzon Island, one last time before. It shut while the air thickened like syrup. 100% humidity, combined with the ground still radiating heat, created a suffocating greenhouse effect, so stifling it was hard to breathe. It felt like you were drawing scalding water vapor into your lungs, not oxygen. Out on the Pacific, about 186 miles off the eastern coast, the waves began to lose their natural rhythm. The sea went eerily flat, but beneath that dark surface, ocean currents were boiling with violence, pumping colossal heat into the spinning engine of destruction offshore Nando, a perfect meteorological monster, fed by unusually warm waters in the Northwest Pacific. NASA weather satellites and Japan's JMA were sending back images that made scientists at the Global Forecasting Center go cold. The storm's eye, the devil's eye, perfectly round, so sharp it was terrifying, with a diameter of up to 37 miles, encircled by a dense, vertical wall of cloud rising 9 miles high. The pressure at the storm's core had plunged to 905 millibars. That was no longer a lifeless number on a chart. It was a death sentence. This record low pressure turned Nando into a gigantic vacuum cleaner of nature, ready to suck everything on the Earth's surface into its hungry belly. The abnormality began seeping into the animal world before humans even realized it. At the coastal markets, sewer rats that normally hid in the shadows suddenly poured into the streets in broad daylight, scattering in chaos like an anthill kicked apart. Despite the presence of humans, against the deep violet sky, flocks of seagulls drifted inland on chaotic trajectories, slamming headlong into neon billboards and the glass facades of high-rise buildings. They fell onto the sidewalks like lifeless stones. They had lost their sense of direction due to low-frequency infrasound waves emitted by the storm, a growling roar the human ear cannot hear, but one that sounds a death knell for the animal world. Dogs and cats in the Tondo slum districts began barking frantically, scratching desperately at the walls, their eyes filled with sheer terror. Their primal survival instincts were warning them that the ultimate predator was coming. 7:30 p.m. The Philippine National Disaster Warning System activated its highest alert level. Signal number 5. Air raid sirens, that haunting sound usually heard only in wartime, now wailed in long, mournful blasts across every corner of Manila, Car horns tore through the thick, stagnant air, seeping into every alley and apartment, awakening the most primitive fears in the hearts of the city's 13 million residents. Emergency bulletins cut into every television broadcast. There were no more polished warnings, only blunt, merciless commands. Evacuate immediately. This is a life-threatening situation. The numbers 168 miles per hour flashed across blood-red screens like blades. But where could they run? The main highways leading toward the higher northern regions were completely jammed. Millions of cars sat bumper to bumper, motionless, turning the expressways into a massive parking lot glowing with solid red brake lights. The blaring of horns, the shouts of people fighting for lanes, the screams of children crying from heat and fear. Chaos began to take root. At gas stations, fights broke out over a single remaining can of fuel. When faced with the overwhelming power of nature, humans began to reveal both the fragility and cruelty of their survival instincts. They were trapped inside steel boxes, looking up at a sky shifting from purple to black, and feeling faint tremors beneath their feet. 9 p.m. The first winds from the storm's outer bands began to reach land. They were not yet storm-force winds, but fast-moving currents of hot, humid air carrying the sharp scent of sea salt and ozone. Roadside trees began to shudder. Leaves and debris were swept into small whirlwinds along the ground. Makeshift tarps at night markets were ripped loose, flapping violently like torn flags foretelling collapse. This was when the human body began to clearly feel the change in pressure. As atmospheric pressure suddenly dropped below 950 millibars, the pressure difference between the inside and outside of the body caused the eardrums to stretch and tighten painfully, a sensation like diving deep to the bottom of a swimming pool. Many people began to feel their chests tighten and choke, their hearts raced, and their heads throbbed like they were being hammered. Elderly people with bone and joint conditions started groaning as deep, aching pain spread through their spines. Our biological bodies were reacting to the violent shift in the physical environment, a biological warning that we do not belong in these extreme weather conditions. 11 p.m. The sky was completely shrouded. There was no longer any boundary between cloud and sea. The dense black night was ripped apart by intrastorm lightning, not striking the ground, but snaking through the clouds like a vascular system, the glowing veins of a colossal monster. And then the rain began to fall, not as droplets, but as bullets of water. The first sheets of rain lashed the metal roofs with sharp, cracking blasts like machine gun fire. The wind escalated dizzyingly from force 10 to force 12, then gusting to force 14. In just 30 minutes, large steel billboards began to warp, letting out a horrifying metallic groan before being ripped free from their bolts and hurled into the streets like giant blades. Streetlight poles shook violently. The streetlights flickered non-stop, casting an eerie, half-lit scene of shifting shadows. Midnight. The storm's core was 31 miles offshore. The eye wall where Nando's most concentrated, most brutal winds gathered began to lick the coastline. The wind no longer sounded like a whistle. It transformed into a deep, continuous growl like the engines of thousands of jet aircraft taking off at once right beside your ear. A low-frequency sound with crushing intensity that made human chests vibrate. Window panes rattled as if they were about to shatter. The single-story coastal houses were the first victims. They didn't collapse. They exploded. The pressure difference was so extreme that roofs were sucked into the sky and walls imploded inward. In the chaotic darkness, people only had time to glimpse fragments of everyday life. Tables, chairs, clothes, TVs being dragged into a pitch-black vortex and vanishing in an instant. The power grid began to sputter, then went dead. The entire eastern coastline sank into absolute darkness. All that remained were sickly green flashes, as high-voltage substations exploded in rapid succession, flaring in the distance like deadly fireworks. For a split second, they illuminated a horrifying sight. A 23-foot wall of seawater was advancing, relentless and heavy. It swallowed seawalls. It swallowed the harbor. The disaster had officially made landfall, and it had no intention of showing mercy. Space felt suffocated. Time seemed to freeze, leaving only raw terror before nature's absolute power. Human beings were now as small as grains of sand before the storm. The gates of hell swung wide open 4:15 a.m. This was the moment the very idea of a city was erased, replaced by the idea of a battlefield inside Nando's killing zone. The 7-mile-wide Eye of Death officially ground into the Luzon coast. If the earlier hours were merely a prelude of shrieking wind, now that sound was gone. In its place came a deep, thunderous boom that stretched on without end, the roar of atmospheric pressure compressed to the extreme, the sound of space itself being torn open by physics. At the storm's center, the measured pressure plunged to an unimaginable mark. 905 HPA. Just imagine it. The air was no longer light. It was heavy as lead, pressing down on the chests of every resident huddled inside shelters. The most terrifying thing about Nando wasn't only the 168 miles per hour winds, but the eye wall replacement cycle unfolding right over land. Normally, that process would weaken a storm temporarily. But with Nando in a rare, worst-case meteorological scenario, it allowed the typhoon to maintain super typhoon intensity while doubling the radius of destruction. The zone of maximum winds no longer concentrated at a single point. It spread outward across a vast region hundreds of kilometers wide. The wind no longer came in jerky gusts. It became a compressed, solid wall moving at the speed of a race car. A formula that flattened every obstacle in its path. Manila, the pride of the Philippines, was undergoing the most brutal surgery in its history. In Makati's financial district, where the city's most glittering skyscrapers stand, the catastrophe unfolded in a cinematic, merciless way. Those 50, 60-story towers were no longer symbols of prosperity, but deadly traps more than 330 feet above the ground. Up there, wind speeds were far more terrifying than at street level. The tempered glass facades, designed to withstand Category 1 hurricane force winds, began to reach their breaking point. First came tiny spiderweb cracks spreading fast. Then, because of the massive pressure difference between inside and outside the buildings, entire rows of windows exploded at once. Millions. Billions of razor-sharp shards burst outward, caught by the wind and spinning through the air, forming a literal dagger storm. They shot forward at bullet speed, slicing through power lines, embedding into concrete walls, and turning anyone unlucky enough to be trapped outside into a gruesome casualty. Inside the premium office buildings, furniture, computers, and paperwork were sucked out through blown-out windows, floating like they were in zero gravity before being shredded by the vortex. But the greatest danger came from steel monsters, tower cranes, perched atop half-finished construction sites. Those gigantic tower cranes, weighing hundreds of tons, began spinning uncontrollably like broken compasses. The screech of twisting metal, the grinding groan of steel rose sharp enough to drown out even the wind. Then came a horrifying crack. The tower mast buckled, and the massive steel jib collapsed, slicing straight down into the low-rise apartment blocks below. Concrete shattered into rubble. A cloud of dust was instantly ripped away by the wind. An entire street was leveled by a single impact of steel. And on the ground, another enemy more vicious than the wind was rising. Water, not rainwater, but seawater. A meteorological tsunami, the nightmare of every coastal nation, had arrived. With the storm's central pressure so low, the sea surface was being sucked upward, and combined with wind-driven push, it formed a 23-foot wall of black water, thick with mud and debris, creeping relentlessly inland. It didn't crash like surf pounding a shoreline. It rose fast and silently, quiet as a giant python tightening around its prey. Manila Bay vanished completely from the map. Seawater poured over the breakwaters, swallowing Roxas Boulevard in an instant. Luxury cars parked in the basement garages of five-star seaside hotels couldn't be moved in time. Now they bob like paper boats, smacking into one another with sharp, cracking blows. Most horrifying of all were the subway system and the parking basements. Black floodwater poured straight down through the entrances, turning these underground spaces into gigantic watery tombs. The torrent carried razor-sharp trash, animal carcasses, oil slicks, and even pieces of shattered architecture, sealing off every escape route. Anyone still trapped down there, inside subway stations that had seemed unbreakable, now faced darkness, icy water, and a slow, suffocating death and despair. The city's drainage pump system had been completely paralyzed after the main utility substation blew up 30 minutes earlier. At the centralized evacuation centers, inside solid sports arenas and schools, panic began to tip into madness. Imagine you're inside a vast domed arena with 5,000 other people. The air reeks of sweat, damp clothes, and feared children screaming, elderly people murmuring prayers. Suddenly, a huge crash explodes overhead. Every gaze snaps upward. The arena's massive metal roof panels begin to shudder violently. Bolts as thick as thumbs can't withstand the suction and fire off like bullets. One panel, then two, are peeled away by the wind, exposing the pitch-black sky screaming above. Rain and wind pour in like a waterfall. Chaos detonates. 5,000 people shove, trampling over each other to hide in the corners of the stands. Under stairwell screams are swallowed by the wind, shrieking through the holes in the roof, creating a deafening resonance that drills straight into the skull. Debris from the ceiling rains down onto the crowd. No one can stay calm. Survival instinct surges violent and ruthless. People shove the elderly aside, climb over others just to claim a sheltered corner from the wind. In nature's fury, human compassion becomes more fragile than ever. Outside, the streets had turned into rushing rivers. The floodwater wasn't clear. It was a churning, muddy brown, moving fast enough to flay flesh. 100-year-old trees were ripped out by the roots and swept down the streets, smashing power poles, fences, and walls. Billboards drifted like rafts, and severed power lines threw off sparks whenever they touched the water. On the radar screens at the Joint Storm Warning Center, Nando appeared as a perfect deadly vortex, glowing red with the highest level danger warning. It was slowing down. That was the worst possible news. The slower a storm moves, the longer it can devastate a single area. It was like a meat grinder turning slowly, methodically crushing every inch of Luzon. No rescue could reach them now. Even armored military vehicles couldn't move in 168 miles per hour winds. Rescue helicopters couldn't possibly take off. Firefighters watched helplessly as electrical short fires flared up, whipped by the wind into giant torches in the storm, impossible to extinguish. Hospitals switched to backup generators, but floodwater was rising to the very edge of the generator rooms on the ground floor. Surgeons in operating rooms had to work by flickering flashlight beams, while outside the windows, the world was collapsing. This was the peak of the catastrophe, the moment humanity realized just how small and utterly powerless it was. Every modern technology, every reinforced concrete structure, every preparation became meaningless before the absolute power of the second strongest super typhoon in human history. Nando wasn't just destroying buildings and infrastructure, it was breaking the will to survive of an entire nation. And this nightmare wasn't over yet. 5:30 a.m. As pale morning light struggled to seep through the thick cloud cover, it brought no hope, only sharper clarity to the tragedy. But the true disaster now no longer lay in the winds, which were weakening slightly as the storm pushed inland. It lay in the cascading collapse of the entire modern civilization system. The last explosion Manila's residents heard? before their world fell into silence wasn't thunder. It was the detonation of the North Luzon Central High Voltage Substation, a colossal voltage surge. A myocardial infarction striking straight into the national power system. The smart grid SCADA system. The Philippines' technological pride couldn't withstand thousands of simultaneous failures. Snapped lines, collapsed poles, and flooding. Automatic protective circuit breakers failed, triggering a chain reaction, a domino effect across the electrical network, spreading at the speed of light. Gas turbine power plants were forced into emergency shutdowns. Satellite substations overloaded and caught fire. In less than 3 minutes, the entire island of Luzon, home to more than 60 million people, and the economic engine of the nation, went into total blackout. Isolation began. Inside flooded shelters, no one knew whether the storm had passed or not. They didn't know if loved ones in the next district were alive or dead. Rumors and misinformation spread faster than a virus. The dam has burst. A second tsunami is coming. The government has abandoned us. An invisible fear crept into their minds, turning panic into potential riot. At major hospitals, backup generators began running out of fuel. The steady beep-beep of ventilators and newborn incubators grew sparse, then died out. Doctors were forced to handbag oxygen by flashlight, eyes brimming with tears, watching critical patients slowly slip from their grasp because machines had failed. But Nando didn't stop in the Philippines. It was a monster that never grew full. After tearing Luzon apart, Nando's core crawled across the island's western side, leaving a dead land behind and surging into the South China Sea. Under normal meteorological rules, friction with land would shred the storm's structure, causing it to weaken rapidly. But no 2025 was a year of anomalies. The South China Sea's surface temperature was at a record 88 degrees Fahrenheit, hot as bathwater. This was the gigantic fuel tank refilling Nando. The moment it touched the warm water, its spiral structure reorganized at a dizzying speed. The eye blurred when it crossed the Philippine mountains, opened again. Razor sharp and pitch black like a gun barrel pointed west-northwest. All of Southeast Asia held its breath, Hong Kong and Macau included. The observatory hoisted Signal Num 10, the highest typhoon warning level. The stock exchange shut down. International airports suspended operations, turning these two bustling financial hubs into ghost cities within hours. The world followed Nando in helpless horror. Global financial markets trembled. Oil prices spiked amid fears that offshore rigs in the South China Sea would be destroyed. The global semiconductor supply chain was threatened as factories in Taiwan and southern China shut down. Nando wasn't just a storm. It was a steel-fisted punch to a world economy already on the brink. Back in the Philippines, the government's rescue effort was nearly paralyzed. The Philippine president declared a national state of disaster. But that announcement only went out over international radio. People inside the storm's core never even heard it. The Army's most elite rescue teams, equipped with specialized amphibious vehicles, were deployed, but they were immediately stopped by roads that had turned into rivers, strewn with thousands of fallen power poles, a maze of deathly live wires. Philippine Air Force Black Hawk helicopters tried to take off in a desperate attempt to drop relief supplies, but the gust's lingering remnants of the storm's circulation were still too strong, forcing them to turn back and make emergency landings. The image of helicopters lying helpless on flooded runways became a symbol of humanity's defeat before nature. International organizations like the United Nations and the International Red Cross began mobilizing resources, but they faced an insurmountable logistical wall. No airports were operating. No ports were safe for ships to dock. Thousands of tons of food, medicine, and clean water were stuck in neighboring countries. While just a few hundred miles away, millions of people were fighting thirst, hunger, and cold. And worse still, the risk of disease began to emerge. Broken sewer systems mixed into the drinking water supply, Dead animal carcasses floated to the surface and began decomposing in the humid tropical heat after the storm. The stench of death rose thick and haunting, signaling a second wave of disaster, cholera, typhoid, and dengue fever. Nando proved a brutal truth. In the era of extreme climate change, national borders are meaningless. A single sneeze from the ocean can bring down the civilization of an entire region. Humanity, for all its technological arrogance, is still nothing more than fragile creatures clinging to the thin crust of this planet. And when the second night fell over the Philippines, no lights came on. Only thick, absolute darkness. The rush of water beneath the floorboards, and the fear of tomorrow. As Nando continued its destructive march toward the Asian mainland, the 23rd of September 2025. Dawn arrived, but the light did not. A dense fog, mixed with ash and salty vapor, spread over what remained of Manila. This wasn't a morning of rebirth, it was a black dawn. The moment raw truth was exposed under daylight. The once glittering capital now looked like a gigantic graveyard that had risen from the deep seafloor. Skyscrapers that once stood as proud symbols of the economy were now only bare concrete skeletons, pocked like honeycombs, looming above a black sea of floodwater where trash and car bodies drifted. Not a single pane of glass remained intact. Silence smothered the space. A heavy, suffocating silence more frightening than last night's roar of the storm. From within the wreckage, shadowy figures emerged. Not crying, not screaming. They just stood there, stunned, staring into the void, eyes hollow from shock beyond what the mind can bear. What Nando took away wasn't only homes and property. It was humanity's permanent sense of safety beneath the sky. Nando wasn't merely a meteorological phenomenon. It was nature's harshest sentence delivered to humanity in the age of climate change. We arrogantly destroyed forests and overheated the atmosphere. And now the ocean was returning that excess energy in the form of monsters called super typhoons. But this nightmare wasn't over. On satellite screens, Nando's enormous cloud mass was still spinning menacingly over the South China Sea. It was creeping westward, carrying Category 5 equivalent destructive force straight toward the mainland of Vietnam and China. Manila had fallen, and now the next cities were holding their breath, waiting for their fate.